Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. Today, we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 12, the Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Joining us again, we have Uncle Sam. Sir, would you take it away?
Gladly, Frank. So, between 1791 and 1819, 9 frontier states had joined the original 13. This explosive expansion of the West was due in part to cheap land, the elimination of the Indian menace, the Ohio fever, and the need for land by tobacco farmers who had exhausted their lands. The Cumberland Road, begun in 1811, ran ultimately from western Maryland to Illinois, and the first steamboat on western waters appeared in 1811. The West, still not populous and politically weak, was forced to ally itself with other sections and demanded cheap acreage. The Land Act of 1820 gave the West its wish by authorizing a buyer to purchase 80 acres of land at a minimum of $125 an acre, in cash. The West demanded and slowly got cheap transportation as well. So, Frank, can you drop some knowledge about slavery and abolition for me?
Absolutely. The ever-present problem of abolition versus slavery came into the spotlight with the passage of the Talmadge Amendment, which stated no more slaves could be imported into Missouri, and children born to slave parents in Missouri could gradually be emancipated in the country. Southern plantation owners saw the Talmadge Amendment as a threat to slavery across the country because they feared the Talmadge Amendment could be reapplied by the federal government to their states as well as to Missouri. They were also concerned with the increasing population of the North, which gave Northerners control of the House of Representatives almost indefinitely, though they still had even agreement in the Senate, which didn't have representation based off population. But Abe, can you elaborate on how this abolition versus slavery compromise was eventually found?
Yeah, so an agreement between the North and South was made in the Missouri Compromise. To benefit the South, it stipulated that Missouri be admitted as a slave state. To benefit the North, Maine was established as a free state, and slavery was overall prohibited in the Louisiana Purchase territories north of the 3630 line. However, the Missouri Compromise did not completely quell the embittered dispute over slavery. It merely swept the problem under the rug. The stage was set for the Civil War in the future. The Missouri Compromise and the Panic of 1819, strangely, didn't reflect badly on President Monroe. He's the only president in American history that has been reelected after a major financial panic. So, Uncle Sam, could you tell me how Chief Justice John Marshall expanded the power of the federal government?
Of course, Abe. Chief Justice John Marshall overall enforced the power of the federal government over the states. Kennedy then lists 5 main cases where Marshall ruled to strengthen the federal government. First, in McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of Maryland tried to impose a tax on the Bank of the United States. Marshall held that the bank was constitutional because of the Hamiltonian implied powers of the Constitution, and therefore denied Maryland the right to levy the taxes on the bank. The case overall strengthened the doctrine of loose construction. In Cohen's v. Virginia, the Cohen brothers were appealed to the Supreme Court after being found guilty for selling illegal lottery tickets. Marshall supported Virginia and convicted the Cohens, but ruled also that the Supreme Court had the right to review all decisions of the state courts with all cases involving the power of the federal government. Third, in Gibbons v. Ogden, the steamboat cases, New York had attempted to grant a private corporation a monopoly of waterborne commerce between New Jersey and New York. Marshall ruled that the Congress alone had the right to control interstate commerce and therefore struck yet another blow at the states' rights. So, Frank, can you tell me about judicial dikes against the democratic excesses?
Yeah, so what Kennedy's doing here is continuing to extrapolate on how Marshall presented the Federalist government as more powerful, the central government as more powerful than the state governments. And he does this with 2 more cases. In Fletcher versus Peck, the Georgia legislature canceled the sale of land approved by the corrupt legislature before it. Here, Marshall stated that this was unconstitutional because the Constitution forbid laws impairing contracts, showing the Supreme Court could invalidate state laws. And the 5th and final case was Dartmouth College versus Woodward, where New Hampshire tried to change Dartmouth's British charter, but Marshall here stated that since the charter was a contract, it was constitutionally protected, meaning business was separated from state control. Also in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, Daniel Webster, a lawyer, argued for the defense very passionately and had a huge impact on the case. In general, Marshall's ruling set a precedent for strong Supreme Court power and the ability of the Supreme Court to roll back state laws. But Abe, can you tell me how America continued to acquire new land?
Yeah, so President Monroe teamed up with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams to shape American foreign policy. The Anglo-American Convention was negotiated with Britain, and 1, it permitted Americans to share the fisheries of Newfoundland with the Canadians. 2, it fixed the northern limit of Louisiana that stretched all the way to the Rockies. 3, it established a 10-year joint American-British occupation of Oregon. So now let's talk about America's interactions with Spain. The bulk of Florida was still under Spanish rule. As several revolutions broke out in Spain's controlled South America, the Spanish were forced to divert those troops there from Florida. Andrew Jackson, embodying the ideal of carpe diem, secured a commission to enter Florida with the pretext that hostile Seminole Indians were residing in Florida. Jackson hung 2 Indian chiefs, but exceeded the treaty when he also seized 2 Spanish posts. Nevertheless, John Quincy Adams demanded land concession from Spain, and in the Florida Purchase Treaty, Spain ceded Florida and Oregon while America abandoned its claims to Texas. So, Uncle Sam, could you tell me how Europe fought against the democracy that was developing in the rest of the world?
Well, sure, Abe. It's very interesting, actually. So, after the Napoleonic Wars, conservative Europe fought back against democracy and liberalism, crushing uprisings in Italy and Spain. Americans were also fearful of Russian intrusion on the eastern side of the country, where Russia controlled all of Alaska up to the north. Great Britain was also worried about European reconquest of its American holdings, fearing for the loss of trade. It therefore sent Foreign Secretary George Canning to propose a joint U.S.-British declaration renouncing territory acquisition in the Americas. So, Frank, can you tell me a little bit more about Canning's proposal?
Yeah, so the manifestation of Canning's proposal to the U.S. was seen in the Monroe Doctrine. Now, President Adams knew that European powers weren't planning an invasion of the U.S. and understood that the declaration would make it impossible for the U.S. to acquire Caribbean territory without being extremely hypocritical. But he also realized that it would be the British Royal Navy enforcing the declaration, and therefore such a move would be relatively safe. The final result was the Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823, and commanding non-intervention and non-colonization across the Americas. Mostly meant to target potential Russian expansion along the Californian coast, the doctrine intoned that colonization of America was done, and that Europe should stay out of Latin American proceedings. In exchange, somewhat randomly, the U.S. promised not to interfere in the Grecian Civil War with the Ottoman Empire. But Abe, can you extrapolate on how the Monroe Doctrine was appraised by other countries?
The Monroe Doctrine angered the European monarchs. However, the monarchs couldn't retaliate for fear of the British Navy's wrath. The Monroe Doctrine had little effect in the Latin American republics, since it was obvious that America was primarily concerned about its own defense against future invasions. The Tsar had already passed the Russo-American Treaty in retreat before the Monroe Doctrine, fixing the Russian land limits at the 54-40 line. Overall, the Monroe Doctrine has never been a law. It was merely a statement of President Monroe's policy, and it has been distorted and edited as America has grown throughout history. Lastly, the Monroe Doctrine enforced the American illusion of isolationism, which had begun after Washington's Neutrality Proclamation. Thank you for watching. Please like,
subscribe,
comment if you have any questions, and we'll catch you guys next time.